Welcome, everybody, to the American Space Museum. I'm Marquette, and we're so glad you're with us for this episode to stay curious. Today, we've got Nick Thomas with us, educator for over 3 decades at Kennedy Visitors Complex. Nick, how are you?
Good to see you. How you doing?
Well, great to see you. This is October 24th, 2022, and we lost this great man, this great astronaut behind us here, Jim McDivitt, passed away. He died on have that just in front of me, October 13th, Thursday, surrounded by friends and family at the age of 93. And Nick Thomas and I are going to do a tribute to this wonderful astronaut. Baby boomers like Nick and I grew up with this man. A great loss. You can't bemoan a 93-year-old person passing away, but he's made an impact that lasts forever in our space program.
Yeah, and you can't bemoan the record of achievement that he leaves behind. He's just a remarkable man, not only in space flight, but in developmental flight tests and several other endeavors.
And Nick's going to tell us his bio in a minute here. We're going to have some personal stories from some of you that sent us stories about Jim McDivitt, meeting him at various autograph events and so forth. He was a key figure in American spaceflight, acting as a pilot while his friend Ed White conducted the first ever American spacewalk. Those iconic pictures taken by Jim McDivitt with a Nikon camera and film. He was born in Chicago, but he grew up in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And I told Nick I never miss a chance to say Kalamazoo. And hello to Aaron Lewis there at the Kalamazoo Museum of Flight up there, called the Air Zoo up there is what they have, a wonderful airplane exhibit up there.
Very good.
And so we'll talk about him. These are the set of handprints that are out at Spaceview Park. We'll talk about how those come about in a minute. So stick around for a nice little program celebrating one of my heroes growing up, Gemini astronauts. Gosh, those missions, 65, 66, 10 of them, like 6 weeks apart, just, and we're teenagers, Nick, you know, just will never forget that energy. And this was a guy that could have walked on the moon, but passed up that opportunity to manage the Apollo program, Jim McDivitt. So we'll talk about him in a minute, but we wanted to get Nick, let's see, let me go forward there. Oh, forward again, there we go. Wanted to get a little update from you as we look at Chris Callie's piece of artwork there about Artemis. Nick, what's the latest about Artemis?
Well, no changes of now. We're still targeting the 14th of November for launch, just after midnight. A lot of
Sunday night and Monday morning, midnight.
A lot of servicing going on in the vehicle right now. The change out of the flight termination system batteries. Also, the change out of some batteries in the ICPSC interim cryogenic propulsion stage, and other structural inspections being done, because, you know, when you roll that thing back and forth from the pad, there are bound to be some displacements and some movement and so forth. So the guys are going to go through all the parts of that vehicle. They're going to look at the foam to see if there have been any cracks in the foam, and basically give it a good health check before they roll it back out to the launch pad, targeting launch on November the 14th.
It's a skyscraper after all that they're taking out there, Nick, and back and forth, and 3 times now. So I got a good feeling about this for some reason. Not that I'm a psychic or anything, but I just got a good feeling we're going to launch it.
I felt especially good after that last tanking test when we were well below minimums on the concentration of hydrogen in the area of the interface between the umbilical on the mobile launch platform, which leads to the vehicle. Seeing those numbers go down well into the acceptable range gave me a good feeling of confidence. Go out there, we'll check everything again, make sure everything's in place, and target the 14th. And
when do you think the rollout will be? Are they saying?
I think we're probably going to be going out to the pad, back out to the pad on the 7th.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds like a Tuesday. Yeah. No, that'd be a Monday. Yeah, if the 14th is a Monday at midnight, so the 7th would be the week beforehand out there. And we're not out of the hurricane season, but we're out of those afternoon cycle of those lightning storms at least.
So far everything's nice and clean in the afternoons, and that's always a good sign.
Well, Nick, one of Nick's main job is, I call him astronaut wrangler. We're so blessed that he wants to be part of American Space Museum Stay Curious program. Marty Winkle, my co-producer. We've been doing this for 2.5 years, 740 episodes. Marty, did you have a good weekend?
677.
677? Okay.
Count it.
He counted.
Counted up this weekend.
We're up to 677 episodes. Whew.
Well, you need a plaque on the wall where you can mark each one off.
Yeah, we did for a while. I did have a whiteboard that I used as my outline crib sheet, and we got away from that. And yeah, I used to put stuff on there. Marty's going to get ready and sell T-shirts when that happens. But Nick does an excellent job putting together the programs for the astronaut encounter. Tell us a little about that. How many times can we see an astronaut every day out there?
Every day. We do a total of 6 presentations, 2 cycles of 3. In the morning at 10 o'clock, we will do an event called Chat with an Astronaut, which that's an additional ticket to attend that. And then at 11 o'clock, we'll have the theater presentation that we call Astronaut Encounter, which is inclusive with your ticket, with your admission ticket. And then at 12, we'll have an astronaut autograph opportunity up on the 2nd floor of the gift shop. That's also included with your ticket. And then we'll repeat the cycle starting at 1 o'clock, and then 2:15, 2:15, 3:15, and 4:15 are the last 3 presentations.
And if you're a local person, you want to get your season pass and go out there to see some astronauts, the shows are wonderful. It's an audio-visual presentation.
Right.
Each astronaut seems to have their own little shtick, if you would.
Mm-hmm.
Highlights certain things. Nick, you do harvest some of those pictures for them and so forth, don't you?
Yeah, and all the astronauts have different modes and means of presentation. Some astronauts, like Wendy Lawrence, do 2 different shows. One show at 11 o'clock and another one at 3:15. But they all have different ways of doing it, different ways of expressing it, and all bring a unique perspective to the flights that they flew.
Well, one astronaut you recently had out there that I missed because I was on vacation, darn it. I wanted to see her, and that was this young lady, Susan Still Kilran.
Right.
And happy 61st birthday to Susan Kilran. She was born Susan Leah Still in Augusta, Georgia, on October 24th, 1961. She's a Navy commander. 2 trips to space. She had kind of an odd situation where it was a deja vu.
Yeah.
Tell us about that,
It was
her 2 trips,
STS
84 and 94, 83 and 94.
STS-83 went up, and then on flight day 3, they had a problem with the fuel cell that caused them to come back home early. But then mission managers got together and said, let's go ahead and recycle the same crew and send them back up. Which they did successfully on STS-94. And it's so far the first and only time that an entire shuttle crew, well, it's actually the only time an entire shuttle crew has been kept together for 2 flights.
And 3 months apart they launched them.
Exactly, yeah.
And the logo, the insignias, they just changed one's blue base and the other one's red. I forget which one they did.
They changed the color because they didn't want to spend the money on a whole new design, so they just changed the color, yeah.
She was the pilot,
yeah.
Nick, and usually she never flew again. Those 2, she was a pilot twice, technically. Right. So why didn't you think she wanted to fly again and potentially be a female commander?
Well, a very interesting career point here, but at the time, Susan, of course, was an astronaut, and her husband was a Navy SEAL, and they didn't feel it was fair to the children to have both parents in such dangerous situations. And so Susan stood down and took the time, decided to become a full-time mother. And she talks about that sometimes during her shows. People will ask her, what's harder, flying in space or being a stay-at-home mom? And she said being a stay-at-home mom because 4 different kids, that's like flying 4 different airplanes without checklists.
That's a good way to put it. 4 kids, they live in Virginia Beach. Her husband, Colin Kilran, like you said, is a Navy SEAL. And she's doing great things, though, Nick, like most of our astronauts in the community. She's a motivational speaker, goes to schools and university. Her main message is live your dream anyone can be an astronaut, and we certainly hope Susan Kilran's having a wonderful 61st birthday there. So
She was asked one time if she was ever scared in space. She said the only thing she's ever scared of was that someone was going to play Wake Up Little Susie for a wake-up call.
the wake-up call on the shuttles missions there. That's cute, yeah. Wake up, little Susie. She probably heard that a bunch of times there.
She's probably heard that in Susie Q more than she wants to.
Everly Brothers, right? Everly Brothers, wake up, little Susie.
Yeah, we're dating ourselves again. That'll be fine.
Way. That's when we got in trouble for just coming home late. And Dad and Mom were waiting for you, mostly Dad. Well, we're here to talk about Jim McDivitt. Like we said, he passed away at age 93. Not one of those names that might roll off the top of your tongue when you're thinking about our astronaut heroes of the 60s, but he is one of mine, and he had some very important missions. So tell us a little about him, Nick Thomas, and this is his astronaut class, correct?
Yeah, these are the Group 2 astronauts, what I call the classic commanders, because you'll see they're all the classic commanders of the Apollo program. And James Alton McDivitt was born on June 10th, 1929 in Chicago, Illinois. He held a bachelor's degree in aerospace engineering from the University of Michigan, and he graduated first in his class. He joined the Air Force in 1951 and flew 145 combat missions during the Korean War, flying F-80s and F-86s. He went on to graduate from the United States Air Force Experimental Test Pilot School and the Air Force Aerospace Research Pilot School, and he served as an experimental test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base in California. All told, during his career, he rolled up some 5,000 hours of flight time in several types of aircraft. He was selected with Group 2 in 1962. He flew as a commander of Gemini 4 in June of 1965, a 4-day long endurance mission featuring America's first spacewalk by Ed White, and they went on to fly as the commander of Apollo 9 in March of 1969, and that, of course, was the first manned test flight of the lunar module in Earth orbit. After his time in the astronaut office, he was named as manager of lunar landing operations in May of 1969, and then went on to serve as the manager of the Apollo spacecraft program in August of 1969, overseeing Apollos 12 through 16. He retired from the Air Force and from NASA in June of 1972. He served in a number of corporate positions, and then in 1981 he joined Rockwell International as a senior vice president, retiring in 1995. Jim was a member of the Society of Experimental Test Pilots. He held numerous decorations and honors from the Air Force and from NASA. They included 2 Air Force Distinguished Service Medals, 4 Air Force Distinguished Flying Crosses, and 5 Air Medals. And from NASA, he was awarded 2 NASA Distinguished Service Medals and the NASA Exceptional Service Medal. And as we said, Jim passed away on October 13th at the age of 93.
Thank you for that. And he had a sense of humor, obviously. He said, I think his signature there says, "This space will get you right in the heart." Taking it seriously there. The Titan missile rocket going into his heart there. With one of the more cohesive teams, I guess is the way you could put it on here.
Very well balanced team with Jim McDivitt and Ed White on Gemini 4. They really worked very, very well together. They complemented one another. While both very serious engineering test pilots, they did not pass up an opportunity for a little humor now and again. In fact, when they were in their press conference after being selected for Gemini 4, as you'll remember, Gemini 3, which preceded them, was nicknamed the Unsinkable Molly Brown, a Broadway show, and that was, of course, in honor of Gus's lost Liberty Bell 7. So at the press conference, one of the first questions they asked was, "What are you going to name your spacecraft?" And Jim turned to Ed and said, "I don't know. What's playing on Broadway these days?"
I'd heard that one. That's a good one there. Marty, you got a question from our Stay Curious watchers out there with Nick Thomas today.
Yeah, we have 2 questions. I'll ask the second one first, since we're talking about Jim. Was Jim the oldest astronaut?
Interesting. I'd have to go back and check.
Actually, I'm pretty sure he's not.
Yeah.
Jim, Frank Borman is the oldest, and then Lovell, and then it was, I believe McDivitt was the third oldest. But I'm pretty sure Frank Borman's the oldest living astronaut, cosmonaut, space flyer, whatever, at 93. And his buddy Jim Lovell's also 93. And then he's passed away at 93. You got 92-year-old Buzz Aldrin, the general. Tom Stafford's
Right.
92, correct?
Yeah.
So we're going to be, missing him here all pretty soon. But we can look that up. But thank you for that question.
The other question is from Doug Forrest. Will there be a tanking test again prior to the Artemis launch attempt?
No, I don't believe so. I think they've psyched out that whole tanking situation in that they're going to go at it at a slower rate than they normally would have. It was using that slower rate that gave us a successful tanking test. So I believe they figured that fix is appropriate, and they'll probably just go straight through with the normal launch processing flow.
Well, getting back to Jim McDivitt here, the Gemini program in 1965 and 66. Nick, it's hard to relate to people today what a moon race we were actually in with the Soviet Union. And we had 10 successful Gemini missions in 2 years. Russia didn't fly anybody during that 2-year period. And we really took control of space and our knowledge in there.
Well, while the Russians were involved in a series of firsts, first man in space, first two people in space, first woman in space, we were concentrating on what was basically a developmental flight test program, step by step, approaching all the challenges that we would have to overcome if we were going to put men on the moon before the end of the decade. So I think you're simply seeing the results of a solid engineering test program with the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo flights.
Which we had to prove that a man could live 7 days in space, 3 days to the moon, 3 days back, a day on the moon. We checked that off with the 14-day Gemini 7 mission.
Gemini 4 was actually the very first long-duration flight at 4 days in length. And back when I was a kid, we thought, oh, boy, I'd love to spend 4 days in space. But if you think about sitting this close to someone for 4 solid days, that's not such an appealing proposition when you're older.
We'd have to get to know each other a little bit better than we know each other now before we jump into that.
That's right.
And you had to be healthy. And who are the guys with there, Nick?
Dee O'Hara, who was the nurse for the astronauts from Mercury through Gemini through Apollo. She was a close friend with them. She could almost be described as being a den mother for the astronauts. She was very close to them and their families as well. And there was a story, you'll remember the story when Alan Shepard was on the launch pad for so long and he had to relieve himself in his suit. Well, after that, they came up with the idea of a bladder pack in your leg that was connected to you by means of a condom. And the condoms came in 3 sizes, small, medium, and large. Well, no self-respecting test pilot is going to wear anything like small or medium, so Dee renamed the nomenclature. She called them large, immense, and unbelievable. That was Dee O'Hara.
And she's still around, I think, 86, 87 years old.
Remarkable.
They really trusted her. They didn't. They would take problems to her and not the chief surgeon or chief of the doctor, Barry, right?
Dee said that if they came to her with a health concern that she could handle discreetly and it was not impactful of the flight, she would do it. However, she told them that if it was impactful of the flight, that she would be duty-bound to notify the flight surgeon.
Well, you've actually got a personal story about Gemini 4 from your childhood priest. Is that right?
This is the crew breakfast on launch morning. And there you can see Ed White off to the far right, and to the left, looking over his shoulder, is Jim McDivitt. But if you look across from Jim, you'll see 2 Catholic priests. And the priest on the far left with the astronaut-like crew cut is Father Nugent. And he was my priest at Our Lady of Lourdes School in Daytona Beach, Florida. The other priest, I believe, is Father Caulfield from St. Brendan's. So for all that time, for years after that, we would all lord it over the kids at St. Paul's by saying our priest had breakfast with the astronauts. That was a big deal to us.
That's some bragging rights back then there. And of course, they're in the. I love this picture, the suit room there.
There's a wonderful air of contemplative concentration in this picture. you're going up the elevator, you're getting ready for launch, and it's really, from a standpoint of a pilot, it can be a very comfortable place to be because you're simply going over all the things you need to remember during the ascent. And the training kicks in here, and you're confident in your training. You're confident that you know the vehicle, that you know the procedures. And so, unlike being what many people consider a time to be very nervous and very apprehensive, it's really a very calm time for these pilots going out to the pad.
They want to go.
Absolutely. It's the astronauts will tell you the one thing that they didn't want to hear during a countdown was a scrub or a hold. They said, let's just go. Wendy Lawrence said her attitude during the countdown was launch me or let me out.
That's good. Well, Nick, you've seen our Gemini Mercury gallery where we have the heart rate and respiratory rate of Tom Stafford and Wally Schirra on Gemini 6 when they had that launch aboard.
You bet.
And when you roll it out, the EKG and respiratory doesn't indicate they were a bit scared. It was like, doggone it, we're ready to go. What's the problem? Come on, let's get going here. Right. It was like that kind of indication on there. So yes, when you're strapped into that thing, you're not thinking too much about the fatalistic things that can happen. That, I think, has been all put behind right?
When they took Alan Shepard's heart rate and blood pressure just before Freedom 7, the doctor, who was Bill Douglas, Dr. Douglas, said, I can't believe your heart rate is this low. And Al said, what do you want me to do, boost it up a little? And he said, no. He said, but you should be registering something.
Well, hope you're enjoying these stories with Nick Thomas. He's the lead communicator at Kennedy Visitors Complex for over 3 decades. Does a great job out there as the astronaut wrangler. Does a bunch of other things out there, of course, one of these behind-the-scenes people that makes your experience out there a wonderful one. And great stories that Nick's sharing with us here on Stay Curious, and only you can tell. And, of course, we got the guys of space, and the cameraman, and a very good one at that, was Jim McDivitt, to take these classic pictures of our American's first spacewalk. This is a photograph you don't see very often of that event. I'm sure we'll see a couple others here in a minute, but really a seminal moment of American space history that says space. I don't care how many times you look at Ed White floating in space. That's what it's all about.
When we saw these pictures in Life magazine and in National Geographic, I mean, they not only captured your imagination, they swept you away in the whole program. They were so inspiring that words just don't do it justice. And just as seminal an image as, say, the Earthrise picture from Apollo 8, these pictures captured for us the human involvement of human spaceflight, the human being out there in the void, walking in space, and it was absolutely captivating. Now, we didn't realize at the time, after 20 minutes of tumbling around in space and then coming back in, a lot of people thought, okay, spacewalking is easy. It wasn't until Gemini 9 that we found out how hard it was, and we didn't really tame the beast until the end of the Gemini program and into the Apollo program. And then for shuttle, we took the science or the art of extravehicular activity and added so many colors to the palette. The ability to work and repair objects in space, to work on the Hubble Space Telescope, the Intelsat 6 operation on STS-49. We really took the art of spacewalking in the shuttle program and totally redefined it to a point where it's hard to imagine what it was like back in the Gemini days when we were limiting ourselves to tumbling around outside the capsule.
Yes, with an air hose supplying you your communications and air. Nick, one of my favorite things, it's not in this picture, but is one of my favorite artifacts at Kennedy Visitors Complex is the little gas-powered directional thrust wand, for better word, that's in the Apollo 1 tribute out there at the Saturn V Center.
What some people call the zip gun. Yeah. That specifically, it was a handheld maneuvering unit. And it was a nitrogen-powered jet gun that would allow Ed to maneuver and roll, yaw, and pitch. And he was able to do that to a limited degree for only about 10 minutes, I think, before all the gas ran out in the gun. They did fly it one more time. Mike Collins had it on Gemini 10, but they had a propellant hose hooked up to it so it wouldn't run out of gas. But I think Mike reported that the gas gun was only minimally useful in what he was trying to do out there.
After these, they decided to practice in underwater, like we do now. It was very a moment of the Gemini program. Particularly, Buzz Aldrin said, "Hey, I'm a scuba diver. We don't have enough handrails out there. We need to practice our movements." And then I've heard Story Musgrave talk about that first Apollo, the first shuttle repair of the Hubble telescope, that he encouraged everyone to learn like a ballerina, where every footprint, your hands had to be rehearsed and choreographed where to put things. And that's how they do things now.
Story said that his exemplar for EVA was Dorothy Hamill.
Oh, really?
And he said, you know, when Dorothy's out there doing a triple axel, she's not thinking about the gold medal. She's not thinking about the post-Olympic party. She's thinking about getting that blade flat square on the ice. And that's all she's thinking about. And Story referred to that as perfection in the moment. And that was a philosophy that he took with him on the various spacewalks that he did over his career.
Absolutely. Story Musgrave, get a chance to see that man talk. Please don't turn it down.
Yeah.
What a great friends. I'm sure it broke everybody's heart to lose Ed White. Yeah. But there's brothers in arms right there, Nick, if you ever saw them.
Yeah, here they are on board the Wasp after recovery, and they're talking to President Johnson on the telephone. And as I say, the two men, McDivitt and White, just complemented one another so well. And both were laser focused on the job to be done, and subsequently they did execute one of the finest of the first and one of the finest of the long duration flights of the Gemini program.
It was, and the EVA was the first 3 orbits or 4 orbits. They did that right away, and then they did some science and other stuff for 3 days up there.
They delayed the EVA for 1 orbit because of some problems, I think, with the tether. But they finally got out just as they crossed the Terminator into daylight, and they had a good solid 20 minutes of EVA time on that flight. There was a lot of humor over the fact that when he was called in, Ed was saying, "Oh, this is fun. I don't want to come back in." But of course, he was only joking. But it was funny. But some of the press people, some of the reporters at the time, wrote it up as though Ed was vaguely on the line of insubordination, which he was not. But
right.
Ed White made that spacewalk a truly human experience. If you listen to the tapes, and you can hear the tapes on YouTube and other places on the internet, when you hear the tapes, he is describing everything that's happening with him, everything he's doing, but at the same time, he's absolutely wondrous about the environment that he's in, the sights that he's seeing, and he was able to capture that in human terms for all of us. And we all remembered that whenever we looked at those pictures like this one here. Remember how absolutely overcome with joy he was, and at the same time, you know, as a professional, glued to the responsibilities that he had undertaken for this spacewalk.
Chris Kraft is saying, "Get him in, get him in."
And the flight director says, "Get back in."
And he said, "This is the saddest moment
of my life." Yeah.
Is what he said.
And Jim told me, he said, "We still got 3.5 more days to go, buddy." And Ed paused and he said, "I'm coming."
I'm coming. And folks under 50, there was no live video of this. No. Okay, we had an 8mm movie or 16mm movie of it coming back. We didn't see these pictures until they landed days later. All we did was hear about it, and boy, it was hard to find any definitive about it. They're up there 4 days, so the weekly magazines, he's about 3 weeks after this landed that you finally saw these astounding pictures there.
Right.
So I always like pointing that out, Nick, that we're spoiled by today's technology.
Well, I remember as a kid when you took the film to the drugstore and there was the anticipation of 2 days later you're going to see these pictures. Yeah. Now you pop them up on the back of the screen of your camera.
That's exactly right. Talking about Jim McDivitt here, and he was an Apollo commander. He was a rookie commander, the first commander that was a rookie there on Gemini 4. And then Apollo 9, tell everybody what that mission was about. An important one for Marty Winkle and the Grumman people.
Well, I love Apollo 9 because I've heard it described by many people as being a connoisseur's mission. And what I mean by that is everything that we had practiced throughout Mercury and Gemini, we were going to execute here as operational on Apollo 9. And we were also going to do several new things. For one thing, we were actually going to put 2 people in a spacecraft and let them fly on their own. And they had to get back and rendezvous and redock with the command service module because that LEM could not come home by itself. So there was the added thrill, if you will, of basically a full-fledged across-the-board experimental flight test program. And these guys just executed it to perfection. As I say, we did everything. We did rendezvous, we did docking, we did spacewalking. We tested the, one thing that we did test was using the lunar module DPS, the Descent Propulsion System, as a backup to the service module SPS. Mm-hmm. And of course, that particular technique came in very handy on Apollo 13. But that was already a known quantity because of Apollo 9.
Exactly, using the descent engine to maneuver in Earth orbit, and then that was all they had to bring him back and get him around the loop of the moon at Apollo 13. Marty's told a lot of good stories about that. Give us the crew here, Nick, that we have.
Yeah, to the left you have the mission commander, Jim McDivitt. In the center you have Dave Scott, who was a command module pilot. Dave had flown previously with Neil Armstrong on Gemini 8. And then to the right, our rookie on the crew, Rusty Schweikert, making his flight as the lunar module pilot on board Apollo 9.
And Scott and Schweikert are still alive.
Right.
In there. I think Scott's 90 in there. And there's Jim McDivitt there. We pulled this out of our archives here. You found another connection to your Catholic Church.
Yeah, there is Jim McDivitt in the center on the back row of that table. And he is seated next to Father Lawrence Connolly. And Father Connolly was Jim's priest in his hometown of Nassau Bay in Texas. So Jim was a very devout Catholic, and he had Roman Catholic priests at both of his launch breakfasts.
We found this other breakfast picture that you think might be the test countdown.
Yeah, this is probably the terminal countdown demonstration test, or as they called it back then, the wet dress rehearsal. And you've got on the left, you've got Jim McDivitt. Next to him in the yellow shirt is Rusty Schweikert. Across from them in the red shirt is Dave Scott. And seated at the head of the table, appropriately, is Alan Shepard, who was the chief of the astronaut office at the time. And by that time, unknown to a lot of people, had been requalified for flight and already had his eyes set on an Apollo lunar landing mission. So Admiral Shepard there with the Apollo 9 crew.
The Apollo 9 was April 68, I want to say.
March of 1969, as I recall.
March of 69. Okay, right. Right. We didn't 68. We didn't have the lunar module ready, or it gone on Apollo 8.
And that was an interesting thing too, with the lack of the lunar module for Apollo 8. There was a question as to who was going to fly that first lunar module test flight in Earth orbit, and that was something that Jim McDivitt and his crew very much wanted to do, because as one of them said, Apollo 8 is simply going to go to the moon, orbit, and come back home. He said, but on this mission, it's going to be fun because we're going to be doing so many things, and a lot of these things for the first time. And just to have the ability to be the first test flight of that lunar module was a plum that no test pilot could ever turn down.
Very famous picture of Jim McDivitt there in one of the modules.
This is in the command module, and this is back in the day before astronauts could shave up on orbit, as you can tell.
Okay.
You can remember all the pictures of the guys coming home from Gemini. They would have the long, well, not the long beards, but the whiskers and such. And here you see Jim. This is probably, if I recall properly, this is after they had finished their test with the lunar module and the LEM had been jettisoned, and it was going to be time to come home. But you can see etched in his face the work that Jim and that crew had to do for the Apollo 9 mission. And it was one of those things where you felt tired, but it was a good kind of a tired, because he'd known that you had really accomplished a lot on that flight.
Because there was 2 vehicles, when they separated, the Capcom had to have words to talk to them. So the call signs become what, Nick?
They were Gumdrop for the command module and Spider for the lunar module. You might remember that, as I said,
appropriate. They both look like that.
Right. Gemini 3 was the last named spacecraft before Apollo 9. She was Molly Brown.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, on Gemini 4, Jim and Ed had talked about naming their spacecraft either American Eagle or Ladybird. Well, a couple of people shrugged at Ladybird. That was, of course, the name of the First Lady at the time.
Yeah.
And then they were kicking around the idea of American Eagle when management came down and said there's going to be no more naming of spacecraft. We're not going to do that anymore. But as you mentioned, with Apollo 9, you had 2 spacecraft and you had to have 2 distinctive call signs for each one. So they gave that choice to Jim McDivitt, and he came up with Gumdrop and Spider. Later on Apollo 10, Tom Stafford came up with Charlie Brown and Snoopy, and that really made management wince. Then, of course, by the time we got to Apollo 11, the first lunar landing flight, the names were going to have to be much more dignified, and they came up with Columbia and Eagle.
Yes, but it was common for aviators name their planes. And ships are named and that sort of thing.
Yeah, you can see in World War II and in the Vietnam War even where pilots had names painted on the side of their aircraft. I think Robin Olds flew a series of airplanes through World War II and Vietnam named Scat 1, 2, 3, and I think he went up to Scat 7 on his F4 in Vietnam. And Bud Anderson had Old Crow as his P-51. And Chuck Yeager had Glamorous Glennis as his P-51 and as the X-1 for when he broke the sound barrier.
And as his wife, too.
Right, that's Glennis. That's right.
That's Glennis.
Yep.
So these are the pictures that you all know. This one taken by, I think it's kind of neat that McDivitt played a role in photography of taking some of the more ingrained pictures in our minds.
Yeah, if you look
close, he took some others here.
If you look closely at that picture, you'll see the scribe marks in the window, and the position of that window indicates that that was the rendezvous window on the lunar module, looking up through the roof, if you will, of the LEM, and then looking across at Dave Scott over in that open hatch of the command module.
They did these EVAs, they stand-up EVAs and so forth.
That was also the first test of what would be the Apollo lunar landing suit, too.
Yes. Jim McDivitt, very hands-on, 2 stories I'll share real quickly. During the Gemini 4 mission, I heard this from a Douglas worker in St. Louis, said that he spent an extra couple days in the spacecraft, and he wanted to know how to open and close that hatch if the locking mechanism didn't work. What would he have to do to lock it manually and all this sort of stuff?
And that came in very handy because indeed that hatch on Gemini 4 proved to be very bulky when they were getting Ed back in. But luckily, due to the training that Jim insisted on, they were able to overcome that problem with that technique that Jim was taught, and were able to successfully close the hatch.
Yeah. And then 3 days later, Ed White's going, "You sure that's closed? You sure that's closed?" Before we go in there. And then another great story from Bill Waldron, who was Marty's boss on the lunar modules, said that McDivitt was at the Space Center, spend the night there as the construction of the lunar module was being put together, and that he wanted to see the legs were tucked underneath. And Marty, there was pyrotechnics that released the spring mechanism for them to roll out. And like 3 a.m, Bill Waldron says Jim comes down, and Marty worked second shift. It wasn't unusual for you to see astronauts or workers in the middle of the night because they worked a second shift. Marty said he always worked, 8 to 8, Marty? 9 to 9?
7:30 to 8.
7:30 to 8 in there. McDivitt comes down in his bathrobe, goes, "I've been thinking about those legs. I want to see them go out." And they go, "Okay, we'll head up a test for you here. We'll do it in about a half hour." And Bill had never seen it done, and they fired the pyrotechnics, and he said that leg went out there and swung and locked beautifully. And he said it was kind of a ballet thing to watch, and it locked. McDivitt looked at him and says, "Very good," and went back to sleep.
And Marty, would you confirm for me that parts of that skin on the ascent stage of the lunar module was probably about as thick as a layer of aluminum foil? Is that correct?
It was 0.012 mil. That's the inside structure.
Mil. Okay.
Yeah. It's thin.
That's a lot
like
to think about.
Aluminum. Yeah. In there.
What
a great guy. We've got a couple personal stories. We asked a few of you to share some of your stories with us here. There he is at the recovery.
USS Guadalcanal.
Yeah. And there he is in later years. Okay, there after he retired, tell the story of why he could have been a commander and walked on the moon. There's no doubt about that, right, Nick? But he didn't want to do that.
Yeah,
why do you think so?
He went on to take a management role in the Apollo program, which he saw as being very critical. He had some unique experience as an astronaut commander for that first flight of the lunar module and the command service module, and he felt that he had a lot to contribute on the management side. He could not only contribute from the standpoint of management and engineering, but he could more importantly contribute from the side of the flight crew. This is what the astronauts need. This is what the astronauts require, and that was part of the qualities that McDivitt brought to management when he came over there. And he was a remarkable manager. He was one of those guys who never made what's the word I'm looking for? Jump decisions, shall we say? But he contemplated everything properly and clearly before he made a decision, and he had a remarkably good batting average as to his right decisions.
And as the Apollo manager there, that went with a bigger paycheck than an astronaut made too. We got to mention there. And then he went and worked for Rockwell, and I've talked to some Rockwell people. Well revered manager to Rockwell.
Yeah, I imagine so. His experiences, management experience out the Apollo program, really molded him into what became, I think, an ideal manager for Rockwell. And as you say, he was idealized by many of the people that he worked for, and as I say, brought those skills to the table. Not only the skills of a manager, but the skills of the guy who was in the trenches, whether he was an astronaut or an engineer on the floor. So McDivitt, a well-rounded engineer and a hell of a leader.
MarQ shares these photos of his induction in the Aviation Hall of Fame there a few years ago. And this is a little gaggle of astronauts, if you will.
Yep.
I believe this is at the Visitors Complex.
Yeah, this is when we were bringing Atlantis over to the Visitors Complex.
See, McDivitt's on the far left there.
Okay.
And then the sunglasses, that looks like Charlie.
Yeah, it could be Charlie Duke. To the far right, I see Fred Hayes.
Yeah.
And I can't really make out anybody. I think I see Dick Gordon in the foreground to the left of Fredo. I can't make anybody else out, though.
Schweiker, is that the back of Schweiker's head there above the shuttle peak there?
I'm looking at that hairline, and it almost looks like Bob Springer, but I just can't be sure. And the height too. That's Springer.
Well, we asked a few of you to share some of our stories there, and one of our Stay Curious followers here, Steve Smith. Thank you, Steve, for sharing a story with us. There's Steve. He said his only time to meet Jim McDivitt was in 2014 at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington. He gave a lecture. He goes, lecture is quite a dignified word considering that it reduced me to howls of laughter. I've actually been reluctant to watch the video of the talk because I was sitting in the front row 5 feet from him, and I'm sure the mics picked me up. So he had a lot of fun. He enjoyed himself, a lot of jokes. But Steve Smith here said that he ordered he made these ties with Commander McDivitt's photos of Ed White's spacewalk. So he ordered 2 of them. He kept one, and this is the tie. And he gave one to McDivitt at this event. And he said, this is the photo of me with my hand, giving it to McDivitt. And this Group 2 legend, and he said that McDivitt thanked him and gave him a hearty handshake, and he hoped that he wore the tie somewhere.
Well, you can see he's getting a kick out of it.
Yeah. So thank you, Stephen Smith, for sharing that story there. And then another story we have is there's McDivitt getting suited up for Apollo 9, and I talked to our good friend Doug Forrest, who met McDivitt at a couple space fests out in the event that they were having, where they had a lot of astronauts doing autographs over the weekend, and Doug Forrest is a pencil artist, and he made this beautiful pencil drawing of McDivitt. And he showed it to McDivitt, who thought it was a photograph.
Yeah.
And he said, no, it's a drawing. And McDivitt looked at it and said, wow, really good. Can I get a copy of it? Here is Doug with McDivitt at that Space Fest in like 2016, kind of an unfinished work there. And McDivitt wanted it, so when he finished it, he sent it to Michigan. Doug, you said that he never asked an autograph for personal information before, so he's a little sheepish to give him that.
Yeah.
And McDivitt was so cordial. He said, "Just call me anytime. Let me know where you're at. I live in Tucson in Michigan. I'll tell you where I'm at." So the next Space Fest, he saw him, and he goes. McDivitt, he never did hear back from McDivitt, though he tracked it and he knows he got this beautiful work of art here. That is cool, isn't it?
That's a beautiful picture.
Yeah.
Really, and like you say, it's photo quality. It's just absolutely stunning.
Well, at the next, McDivitt saw Doug and he called him by his first name. He says, "I got your drawing. I love it. I haven't got it framed yet, though." But Doug said, "What a great guy, great experience." And he was overwhelmed meeting his hero, like we are so many times on there. So, good story and good artwork. We had Doug on a Stay Curious a month ago or so. Hi, Doug. He lives in Los Angeles area there.
Great artwork, Doug. Outstanding.
And then, of course, here is the seminal picture of the EVA photo taken by Jim McDivitt. This red labeled up there. This is a $200-300 auction item there, a real NASA photograph that our friend Chris Callie. Chris tried to call you a couple times, and Chris turned this into his acrylic painting of that. And when he talked one-on-one with McDivitt, they're signing his book. That's Chris in the foreground, McDivitt. He got a lot of tips about the color. I remember Chris saying that the beautiful colors, the blacks and the whites, and there's Chris and McDivitt, but just how everything was so pronounced, and that's why Chris made his blue balance there.
I think that is a tribute both to Chris's ability and talent as an artist, and Jim's ability to describe those colors so accurately. I think that just matches so perfectly many of the pictures you see of the Earth from the shuttle and from the Apollo programs. But yeah, he nailed it. It's beautiful.
And that's on our T-shirt that we offer for sale as a fundraiser for us there. So thank you for sharing those personal stories there. Again, Chris Callie with Jim McDivitt there a couple years ago. And, of course, McDivitt knew Paul Callie, Chris's father, the renowned there. But what a wonderful guy. One other story I'd like to share as we look at, we have two sets of handprints of McDivitt, one in our Gemini gallery, and somebody's left flowers out there on it. And then our Apollo gallery here, where he's prominently displayed again. And these handprints, we call them, were harvested. Most of them, over 30 handprints at Spaceview Park. Most of them acquired by Charlie Mars, a NASA manager that is who I call our godfather of our museum. This has been Charlie's baby for over 20 years. He's guided the thing, and he's finally stepped down at age 87. But Charlie's story about giving Jim's handprints was the after story. He said Jim became Apollo manager at Johnson Space Center sometime after Apollo 9. And at one point they were having trouble with fluids at one of the missions. So he requested a 50-gallon drum of these fluids. Charlie forgets what the fluid was at Kennedy Space Center for them to analyze it. Well, as it turns out, this 50-gallon drum was always in the way. It was never used for anything, and it was a huge bother to a lot of folks. 50-gallon drum sticking around somewhere at Kennedy Space Center would not go unnoticed. So Charlie Mars says that he was at Johnson Space Center for McDivitt's retirement party. And for he represented Kennedy Space Center in Houston at McDivitt's retirement party. So Charlie Mars had an idea. He got a 50-gallon drum, had it painted to represent the one in the 70s, presented it at a ceremony to McDivitt as his going-away gift from Kennedy Space Center. And Charlie Mars said, I told McDivitt it still had fluid in it, and KSC was tired of storing it.
Now,
for
will
him.
you get rid of this thing for us, please?
So, always a lot of good gotchas
Yeah.
out
Oh,
there
yeah.
among the astronauts and the workers out there.
Yeah.
But so we hope that you've enjoyed this little tribute to really a great man, 93 years old. Hard to say, that he didn't live a rich life. And to the end, I know he was still giving it away. And meeting with people and appreciative of the, if you want to call it, the fan base.
Yeah, absolutely. A wonderful ambassador for the manned space program for the United States, and a man whose achievements are woven throughout our space program to this very day. I mean, the things that he achieved both on Gemini 4 and Apollo 9 are things that are integral to our experience in manned spaceflight today, right up to the International Space Station and going on to the Orion program. So from all of us who are closely or even remotely connected to the space program, I say thank you, General McDivitt, for everything you've done. Job well done.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we hope you've enjoyed this. So we're going to name off some of you watching. Gary Gerald got off his tractor in North Carolina. Hey, Gary. Doug Forrest, thank you for sharing your artwork. Chutman Changram, Melissa Pope, I hope your week's going good at the Space Coast Office of Tourism. Tom and Mark Usiak are on board. Elise Radel. Why don't you read a few of them off there for me in your introduction astronaut voice there.
Oh, goodness, we've got... you gave me... You let me start with a good one, didn't you? Okay, John Manglo, Joyce LeBlanc, Murphy, excuse me. Owen, help me with that one, Mark.
Russagao.
I'll take your word for
Russagao.
it. Matt Rudd, Lucy West Benal, Daniel DeJong, Carlton Bailey, of course,
Yep.
arch criminal Carlton Bailey, Robert Law, Tom Celentano, William Whiting, Dave Strange, Hazel Stangy. I'm sorry, that A looks like an R.
So
yeah,
they're proud of their Michigander.
Hazel Banks,
Hi, Hazel.
Brad Mackinnon. Okay, Neil 1030, Bruno Le Cadeau, is that?
Yeah, Corden.
Yeah, Corden. Okay, you turned it over to me where all the hard
Yeah.
ones came up, didn't you? And finally, Tammy McGloge Miller.
Yeah.
If I'm reading
Google
that right.
Miller?
McGoogle Miller.
Anyway, we're glad that you're
We're
all
gonna-
getting your week started off here with Nick Thomas. We're so glad that Nick wants to be part of our program here. You have such great stories, and he comes prepared, and we're always anxious to have you here talking about. But we're talking about the shuttles of the month now, or a great astronaut like this, Nick. Thank you for giving your time to the American Space
Well,
Museum.
always a pleasure and always a lot of fun coming here and being part of the show.
Appreciate that. Marty, we got any house cleaning to do?
Nope.
All right. Good job for you. Good getting our week started off here. Great. Tuesday, I'm going to do some shuttles of the month. Wednesday, we got Mikey Haddad is going to come in and feature one of the payloads of Rocktober. And Tuesday or Thursday or Friday, we're going to get Terry White, the manager of one of the orbital processing facilities in here, and catch up. Terry's
always
had
got
some
some
surgery,
great
and he's feeling better. So that's what we do here at the American Space Museum, is try to get you space workers, people involved in the space community like Nick Thomas here, or give you some good stories that maybe are outside the box a little bit about space shuttles or space history. Because after all, here at the American Space Museum, we celebrate the birth of the American space age in its delivery room, Brevard County. So, Nick, anything you'd like to say?
Well,
as we
again,
close here?
Thank you very much for everyone who's looking in. We not only enjoy doing this, but we believe in this because it's so important to keep this history and to keep this heritage alive. And as I say, delivering it from what is essentially the cradle of American manned spaceflight, Cape Canaveral and Kennedy Space Center.
And with our one-of-a-kind Space View Park behind you, truly a Taj Mahal or Roman Colosseum, nothing like it on the face of the earth, where you can put your handprints on the great Jim McDivitt next time you're in town here. So, well, on behalf of Nick and Marty Winkle and our whole staff here at the American Space Museum, led by our leader, Karan Conklin, I'm Marquette saying I can't wait to see you again to bridge the space between us.